Hi everyone, welcome to the Microsoft 365 Virtual Marathon. I hope you've had a great conference so far. Welcome to my session, Teams, let's talk about security. For anyone who hasn't met me or doesn't know who I am, my name is Chris Hord. I'm a partner education lead with Fusion here in the UK. And before we get underway, just a little bit of housekeeping first of all, to mark your calendars for the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. That's coming up next year, March the 23rd to the 25th in Las Vegas. So this is the virtual format, and then we're moving back next year to the physical. So I just want to move and say thank you to all of our generous sponsors and to the organizers for the event today, and especially to CoreView for sponsoring this session. A big shout out to them. Thank you very much. So what to expect from this session? We're going to break it down into three parts. Why is it important about security when we are rolling out Microsoft Teams? This is going to be what we call an overload session. So it's going to be coming thick and fast in ways that we can secure our teams. The second part is going to look at how we can actually secure those teams. We're going to look at identity. We're going to look at threat protection. We're going to look at information protection. We're going to break it down. And as said, it's a kind of overload style. So we're going to see feature upon feature of how we can improve our security posture. And then to wrap up, we're going to bring all of those together for some calls to actions in order to get started today. We've got a lot to talk about, so let's get on. So firstly, I'd just like to opening up the session to say a happy birthday to Microsoft Teams. Teams was 3 years old this year in March, and the story has so far really been about the growth of Teams. When we think about Teams being 3 years old, it started back in 2016 with SharePoint, with Skype for Business Spaces, and then it won over the course of 2017 and 2018. It was Best in Show of Enterprise Connect. In July last year, 2019, at Inspire, we heard about that number, which was 13 million daily active users, and it overpassed Slack for the first time. But this year, the growth has been absolutely phenomenal. We can see at the end of last year, it was 20 million. In March, it was 44 million. In May, it was 75 million daily active users. So that has been absolutely phenomenal growth. And if we look at some of the other statistics, there was a 120% increase in 4 months between November and March. In March, in 7 days, there was a growth of 12 million users. And if we look at one of the workloads, which is meeting and calling, Microsoft reported that per day, on the average day, there was 900 million minutes of meeting and calling. Absolutely phenomenal growth. Last year at Inspire, they predicted that by the end of their year, it would be 50 million. As you can see, 75 million already. They far surpassed their numbers. Now, what's fueling that growth? Firstly, there has been a lot of functionality adds within Microsoft Teams over the past year. I'm not going to drain all this slide, but I'll pick out a few. The first is private channels, which we will talk a little bit about today. That was the biggest user voice on Microsoft Teams with 25,000 votes. We have the client for Linux. We've had the ability to tag within Microsoft Teams and channels, shared system audio in both meetings and now live events, information barriers, being able to restrict information within your Microsoft instance between two users. So Microsoft has been giving businesses and its users what it wants, and it's seeing that growth fueled as a result. But there's been other factors as well. If we look down the left hand side, Teams resonates with businesses and with users. If I'm going in and having a conversation with an organization that's not using Teams, then 99 times out of 100 it's a positive one, because people can see their organizations using Teams. In addition, Teams is a central part of Microsoft's strategy. So Microsoft has devoted its weight of resources and development behind it, and that's why we're seeing this really, really fast cadence of functionality adds. In addition to a large community, so if you go onto the tech community, there's over 150,000 in the Microsoft Teams community, which is second only to Office 365. Probably the biggest factor has been COVID-19. So COVID-19 and since has really changed the way that we are living and working. So in addition to all the social distancing, businesses are changing to have to work remote. And in consequence, there has been this massive uptake and adoption of Microsoft Teams, in addition to several other solutions like Zoom within the market. Now, I'm not going to divulge, or have to bring up COVID-19 in terms of the numbers, but if we think about when COVID-19 and the implications started occurring back in February and March, that's when we were seeing that massive jump in numbers, and it has continued ever since. So even before COVID-19, there was this kind of, I would say, Teams adoption was still growing really rapidly. It was 13 million in July last year, and it was 20 million in November. So that was a growth of around 7 million users. So Teams adoption has been rising exponentially. But when we think about adoption, we always think about the growing need for governance within Teams. And this has been rising as a result as well. So when I go and talk to businesses, when I go and consult for them, they often fall into one or two buckets. So we see organizations that have a reactive need for governance. So what they did is that they've already set up, Teams is already in flight in the organization. They've been eager to adopt it. They've just switched it on in their Office 365 tenant, or they've bought a free Teams trial and then converted to a paid version, and they've just dived in and used it. And that governance and security and compliance has come as a secondary consideration. So when we go and talk to those kind of organizations, we go in, we say, have you considered things like, is your data safe in Teams? How can you restrict the creation of Teams? How can you control Teams on your devices, your mobile phones? Can you see what's going on within your Teams environment? We often have to dial them back and then almost kind of do a reboot of their Teams adoption. But as well as that reactive need, we see others that have a proactive need. So when we go in and we have a talk to them, they're hesitant to adopt Teams because they need assurances of control and the protection for their users and their data. So with this massive explosion and growth, we are also going to see an explosion in need for security, because that comes under governance, and we're going to come and see it from both this reactive and proactive need. But when thinking about that explosive number, I think that the numbers really kind of show why security is important. Firstly, this exponential growth and now having 75 million users on Microsoft Teams is really crystallizing Teams as a valuable target for people who want to get to your organization's data. It's a vulnerable target for people with malicious intent. Secondly, with so many users now using Teams and placing Teams in the center of their business as the hub for teamwork, more and more data is going into Teams and being accessed through Teams. So when we think about Teams, it's a converged application, right? So it's not just about Teams, but it's about SharePoint and OneDrive and Exchange. We are bringing all our apps together within Teams. So by using Teams, we are accessing many of the other applications within Microsoft 365. Thirdly, Teams needs to be a safe environment for people and for businesses. So businesses need to be able to have confidence within Microsoft Teams. Teams isn't just about productivity, it's about secure productivity. And finally, we have to think about the repercussions if we start to neglect security of our Microsoft Teams instances. So on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the issues that Zoom has been experiencing over the past few months. I'm sure that you've seen many of them online or read about them. Things like Zoom bombing, the fact that they've been routing traffic through China, zero-day exploits of Zoom for sale, and about, it's been unclear about the encryption that they actually use. So security is very, very important, not only for protection, but for confidence in a service and to avoid those repercussions. And so in thinking about all those things, we then need to pivot our thinking a little bit, because it's not just about what is in Teams in order to be able to protect it. This is a kind of shared responsibility of both Teams and the rest of the Microsoft 365 stack. So we need to use all of the security controls within Microsoft 365 in order to harden our security posture of our Teams instance. Now, this is a shared responsibility because Microsoft provided the tools to be able to do this, but we are the ones in many cases that need to go along and implement them. So security is a shared responsibility between us and Microsoft. So we recognize now the importance of security, and we're having conversations both from a proactive and a reactive with organizations. But now it comes down to the what and the how. How is it that we harden our team's security posture? Well, we're going to break it down into 6 ways. We're going to start with some security 101s. We're going to look at identity, threat protection, information protection, and monitoring. These kind of midsections in the middle are what Microsoft class as the 4 security pillars of Microsoft 365. Then at the end, we are going to cap it with having a look at education. So starting off with the security 101s, we first need to understand about the security that's built in with Microsoft Teams. Now, this is available for everyone to see on docs.com, but whenever I talk with an IT administrator in an organization about the security within Teams, they don't kind of know this. I've never seen it on docs.com, but it is there and it's easily accessible by anyone. So Microsoft Teams was developed with a security development lifecycle. What that means is that when it was built, because it's a cloud native application, it was designed against threat models. And, security improvements was built into the coding practices by design. Secondly, there is a high level of encryption in transit and at rest, if you look at the list here on the slide. So if you were thinking about when data travels server to server, that traffic is mutual TLS, whether it's the Teams client connecting to the servers, that is under TLS. Audio and video sharing is under SRTP. And at rest, is BitLocker AES 256 encryption. Now, between its development in the security development lifecycle and with the encryption measures in place, Teams in itself is set to withstand a lot of attacks against it. So if we look down here on the right-hand side, whether it's a compromised key attack or an eavesdropping attack or a man-in-the-middle attack, it's designed to actually withstand many common security threats, including denial of service, because it uses and leverages Azure DDoS protection being built on Azure in order to be able to withstand a traffic trying to exhaust it and kind of overwhelm it. So we have the security built-in measures. We also have the security standards. This is another thing that isn't that common knowledge amongst people that use Microsoft Teams today. But Microsoft Teams meets 90 regulatory standards. And if we were to call out a few of those security standards, these include ISO 27001, so that's the Information Security Management System, and the security and control of PII, which is 27018. Over on the right-hand side, you can see that it meets the SOC requirements and also industry standards such as FedRAMP and HIPAA. Teams is a Tier D application, which means in Microsoft terms, it has to have industry-leading compliance commitments by default. And Microsoft is completely accountable for this. It's not just them saying that they have these standards, but you can go to the Microsoft Trust Center today, and if you look in the auditing section, then you will actually see their audit reports for SOC and for ISO and for PCI. So of all of the applications Microsoft do, Teams is in the highest tier for security and standards. We can be guaranteed that it is compliant. Third, one of the things that can really help us moving forward with how we manage Teams and think about Teams from a security perspective is understanding security concepts. So there are 3 that are interrelated and what I want to call out. The first is defense in depth. You have to approach things from the perspective that people are trying to get to your data. And it's not about any one singular thing that we do. So for example, if I apply multi-factor authentication in my Microsoft 365 tenant and my team instance, MFA alone is not going to prevent these attacks. So what we need to do is we need to put up measure upon measure upon measure, and you will see some of these measures put in place today. It's about layers of an onion, if you can think about it, that these barriers that you put in front of between the attacker and the data which they want to get to. Second of all, it's about the principle of least privilege. We need to use roles. We need to use role-based access control. Do people have the access just that they need? So what that means is that you don't give all people admin controls on teams. You don't make them all owners of teams. You only give them access to what they need to access. This is a common problem. I walk into businesses and people, they don't often have these controls. They let all of their people have all of their access to public teams. Is that necessary from a security standpoint? And thirdly, we have zero trust, this concept that we must assume that the organization will be breached. And are we protecting all of the devices that our application, that Teams, is running on? It's all very important to understand these concepts because they will inform our approach to security going forward, but will underpin your strategy and your security posture. And lastly, in terms of the security 101s, it's about data residency and the location of data in Teams whilst at rest. Now, data residency is really easy to find out. So if you go into your tenant and you come up, and if I go to show all, and then I go to settings, and then I go to my org settings, so that's just going to call up. And then if I go to the organization profile, and then I click in the data location, then I can see where my data for Microsoft Teams is at rest. But more so, where is the actual data? So if I upload a file to Teams, where does it go? If I'm in a chat or conversation, where is that message stored? And so in the right hand side, you can see the data entity storage. Now you have and hopefully receive the decks after today, so you'll get a copy of this. This is also on docs.com, but this will give you a complete view so we can understand what it is that we have to protect. The files that go into Teams, if you put a file in a team, that goes into SharePoint. If you put a file in a private chat, then that's actually a file from OneDrive for Business. So we don't only have to protect Teams, we also have to protect SharePoint and we have to protect OneDrive. The chats and the conversations, they go into Exchange. The meeting recordings we have, they go into Stream. So we need to understand exactly where the data is underneath of Teams. So by understanding, where our data is at rest in terms of its data residency and in terms of its location, where the data actually sits, we have a better understanding of what to protect. And again, that can focus us on what it is that we're doing. So now moving on to identity. Identity is important because identity is the front door. That is how Microsoft characterizes identity. And these are pretty common approaches that a lot of organizations are starting to employ, at least multi-factor authentication. So identity really is the starting place to think about security after those 101s. Now, multi-factor authentication, this is requiring security, more than one security invalidation procedure, and Microsoft by the numbers specifies that it blocks 99% of account compromise attacks. Multi-factor authentication is something that you know, such as a username and password, something that you have, such as a mobile phone, and something that you are, so you can use the fingerprint or biometrics. Now, again, like I say, most businesses already employ multi-factor authentication, but we can go beyond that with conditional access. So with conditional access, we are setting conditions to be able to access your corporate resource. So to give you an example, I'm standing in my office. I can access Microsoft 365 and I can access Teams. But the moment that I walk out of the office and I'm trying to connect on another device, I can't access it anymore. So conditional access has certain conditions, so of like location, device, or application. You can set that people within your business can only access Teams from either their homes or the office. And that's really important, because if you think, if some, I know you have the concept of working from anywhere, but certain people may not work from anywhere. They may work from the home or the office. And if they do, and that's the only place that they work from, then it would make sense to lock it down. Or conditional access can work in tandem with MFA, so that if you are working outside of a trusted location, then you must use MFA. The third in the triangle is Microsoft Authenticator. So you may use Microsoft Authenticator in conjunction with MFA. It's a single app that you can use for authentication and makes MFA a lot easier at the touch of a button. But the hidden benefit of using Authenticator is that you can also use Authenticator not just for your Microsoft 365 corporate accounts, but also for LinkedIn, Twitter, and many other cloud services that you use where you have other identities, because attacks aren't just going to come at you in your Office 365 environment. You get things like social engineering attacks that tries to get through that way. So we have MFA, conditional access, and Authenticator. We also have Azure AD Identity Protection. Now this comes in Azure AD Premium 2 plan. This automates the detection and remediation of identity risks. In other words, we can't monitor these things manually all the time. So Azure AD Identity Protection uses machine learning to study behaviors, and then once it detects an anomaly, it then blocks or challenges that. The famous example that I tend to use when I'm teaching the fundamentals courses is impossible travel. I'm logging into Teams here in the UK, and in an hour's time, somebody is trying to log in to Teams with my credentials from Manila in the Philippines. That can't possibly happen because that's too far of a travel distance in the time. So Azure AD Identity Protection will either, depending upon your settings, either block or either challenge by MFA to get in to Teams. Azure AD Identity Protection also looks at unfamiliar sign-in properties, malware-linked IP addresses it's accessing from, and anonymous IP addresses. So if somebody's trying to log on, for example, through the dark web, through the Tor browser, it's a great service to have on top of MFA and conditional access. As talked about, we have role-based access control, we have admins, we have owners, and we have members. Define who are the admins inside your environment, who are the owners of Teams, who are the members going to be. But when it comes to those administrative roles, are you assigning global admin to your administrators? Whereas if they are just managing Teams, then it would be better to give them just the Teams service administrator. With role-based access control, you are having control about who has access to what resources. So if we go into Teams, okay, every single time that we create a team, are we evaluating who the owners are of the team and who are the members? Are we seeing several owners like this? Because maybe that is too many owners for who actually needs that. In addition, in Microsoft 365 Admin Center, we can go into the users and we can evaluate our users as to what permissions that they have. So say, for example, here, I'm going to have Vesku, and I can check Vesku's role simply by clicking on, and it's going to spin up here. I can see, okay, if I manage his roles, he has no administrator access. But if he did, and he was managing my Teams instance, then I'd probably look to move him from an administrator or a global administrator down to a Teams administrator. There are many different administrator roles for Teams, but we need to clearly define who has access to what in our Teams environment. And then we get on to two things, which is dynamic membership and entitlement management. Dynamic membership, we can set up in Azure AD. It's rules that check for user attributes. And when, for example, a user changes role and a user attribute changes, it automatically assigns what teams that user is a part of. Entitlement management, this is all about controlling guests. So again, this is an Azure ADP2 functionality. You would have access packages that contain policies, and you would assign them to guests. Once the guests had kind of expired their access package, let's say it's 90 days or 6 months, that guest will be removed from your environment. So we don't have to manually go through, because guests can be a problem. If we have lots of guests essentially in our accounts, if their account gets breached, somebody might then gain access to our Teams environment. So are we regularly or having something in place that can do this automated to remove guests from account? Make sure the people that are accessing your Teams and are in your Azure Active Directory are the right ones. So now we move on to threat protection, pillar 2. With threat protection, we start out with beginning to kind of try to restrict the attack vector. We can do this through a couple of ways. First, we can look to restrict team creation, and we can do that either through PowerShell or through third-party applications such as SalesTeam. By default, anyone can come into a Teams instance and go to join or create a team. That's great. But then the more teams that there are, not only causes, I would say, I've seen organizations that have like 120, 180, 240 teams that people are a part of. It creates team sprawl. But also as well, if we think that the more teams that we have in our environment, the more bigger the attack vector. So, and of course, we have insider attacks where people can start creating teams for malicious intent. So we can restrict that team's creation through PowerShell and make it centrally controlled by a team. In addition, we have to have an appreciation of managing the team's lifecycle. Do we have Office 365 expiration policies in place? Do we have a policy in place for archiving and deleting teams? Do we put our teams on legal hold? These are all things that we have to consider, and by using them, we can increase our security posture. But also as well, are we using things like moderation? Are we kind of looking into how we design teams and what they are used for, and being a bit more, putting them under scrutiny, so that generally speaking, if we are looking at well-designed teams, we have less, because they actually are built with proper intentions. We're not just throwing up disposable teams and adding guests and adding apps that, left, right and center, which is all the time increasing our attack surface. We also have policies and settings. So if I jump into the Teams admin center, so here we go, I'm in my Teams admin center. We have things like messaging policies, we have calling policies, we have meeting policies. These can all control what people do inside your team's environment. And so good management of policies can really go a long way to improving your security. I want to take 2, just call out 2. The first is meetings. So we can ensure that the lobby is on. If the lobby is on, people can't just break into our meetings, and we go down that road of the Zoom bombing phenomenon. But we can also use things like presenter and meeting controls. So if I come into my Teams admin center and I go to my Teams meeting policies, okay. So this is just going to call up the Teams meeting policies. There we go, the global policy. And I scroll to the bottom. You can see that I can automatically set the policy to only admit people in my organization. Everyone else, anonymous logins, right, or anonymous people that join anonymously will always hit the lobby. That is, for example, a good security practice. The same applies to apps, ensuring that app permissions are implied inside the environment. So if we go down to the app permission policies, and then we go to manage apps, we can automatically set which apps are blocked inside the environment or not. Because some of the, are all these apps necessary? Will they ever be used? Do we want to give our users permissions? If I go into that app, I can simply turn it off. If I go to the permissions policies, so now I'm going into there. Everything is allowed by default. Now, do you want every user inside your organization to have access to 400 apps, especially when you don't know if those apps are certified, or if you install apps, will they, what information that will send about your tenant to other apps? So you'll want to make sure that you leverage the permissions policies too. So I can come into third-party apps. I may not decide that I want to block all of those apps, but I can allow a policy where I allow specific and block all others. So if there's an app here, I'm going to just go, so I'm just going to go and add Flipgrid, for example, and permit that, and then save my policy. So policies and the settings within inside the Teams admin painter are a really important part. We also have safe attachments and safe links. So safe attachments is in general availability today. You can access and turn that on in the security center if you have the right Microsoft 365 SKU. Now, what that will do is it will detect and block malicious files in team sites or document libraries. So if somebody uploads a malicious file into a Teams conversation or comes up in a private chat, then that file, if you have safe attachments on, it can't be opened, it can't be copied, it can't be moved, or it can't be shared. So Microsoft 365 is going to isolate that to prevent that attack moving forward. It will then show up in the advanced threat protection reports and quarantine in the security center. So you're protecting against zero-day malware attacks. And you can imagine a scenario: someone's guest account gets compromised. The attacker logs in as the guest account, it uploads something that looks like a Word document or an Excel file. The moment that you click it and open it, then the payload will come down onto the machine. Well, the safe attachment, that would not happen. Safe links, which is in public preview, which is the other half of advanced threat protection. This is detecting and going to block malicious URLs. So again, we have that scenario where if you had a compromised guest account, or if you would imagine that external access is on and somebody then puts a fraudulent link into a channel conversation or a private conversation, and you go ahead and you click that, well, this is what you will see in the right hand side. It will actually be blocked in the Teams client itself. So you want to prevent threats emerging through the Teams application, either through attachments or either through safe links. As said, this is part of advanced threat protection. So that's an add-on that you will get through certain Microsoft 365 SKUs or in a standalone plan. Finally, in terms of the threat protection, it's not just about protecting the Teams app or protecting the data within that. It's also about the devices that you use the Teams app as well. We've got a few options here. We can look at BitLocker to encrypt our drives on our laptops and our desktops. We can look at Defender ATP. So if something did come down from the Teams client, then it's got things like Exploit Guard and will take countermeasures from on your actual desktop. You then have Intune. Intune is mobile device management and mobile application management. You can use Intune to apply things like app protection policies, which we will see within the next section. It's not just about Teams as an application, it's the devices that you use it on. Now, with Intune, for example, you can block the actual store on either your Windows device or your iOS device, which means that users can't come along and download fraudulent or rogue apps out of that store. That's an example. With Intune, you have compliance policies. So, for example, if somebody tries to connect a jailbroken device, the last thing you want to do is be in a situation that there is somebody in your business, they go and buy a device. Imagine they buy an iPhone. They're thinking they're going to help your business by putting their applications such as SharePoint and Teams on that mobile phone, and that's a jailbroken phone that's already rooted. There's going to be quite a problem. So Intune, Defender ATP and BitLocker protect the devices that you use your Teams instance on, not just the app. Moving on to pillar 4, which is information protection. This is all about the data and protecting that data within Teams. One of the ways you can do this is with private channels. I mentioned private channels earlier. Private channels was that most requested user voice. They differ from standard channels. Only owners and members who have been added can actually access the content. I completely understand the concept of teamwork and the transparency that some people say need in teams, but also as well, there might be areas of a team that you may want just to cordon off from everyone else to protect that information. So I'm going to go and add a channel, and I'm going to then go and add my private channel. All I do is click on privacy, click next, and then I can type members of my team, click add, and then we're done. And then you can see that my private channel is denoted by this lock on the right hand side of this name. It also creates for me an isolated and a separate SharePoint site collection. And that means that other users within inside my organization or guests that are in my environment can't access that information because it's in that private channel. You can have a maximum today of 30 private channels, and chats are stored in private mailboxes, not the mailbox associated with the Office 365. So there might, information might be, that important that we need to limit collaboration a little bit. We can also go beyond this in terms of what we call sensitivity labels. Now, sensitivity labels can set the privacy of the team automatically by just applying the sensitivity label. We would do this within the security center. We would create the actual label itself. And then once we've created that label in the security center, then those sensitivity labels will appear when creating the team. Now, when you create those sensitivity labels, you can set whether guests can access the team. You can set whether unmanaged devices can connect to that team. And you can apply that label to content such as files as well. It doesn't just have to be applied to the team. But this is something, a quite recent addition. So if we're going to say that when we create a team, we're creating a confidential team, no guests will be able to join it and no unmanaged devices can connect to the team. So we can have teams inside our environment where we collaborate with guests and others that are just for our RAs only. So that we would look to employ sensitivity labels along with private channels. So we would create, if we've got a very sensitive, imagine that we have an HR team inside our organization, we would then create a sensitivity label such as confidential, as you would see on the right hand side. We would then create that team so that no guest could access it. We would then put private channels in there so that only people could access those channels in certain areas. So classify and protect your teams in the same way that you classify and protect your files. That's starting to make teams really secure. We've applied our sensitivity label, we've applied our private channels, and inside our private channels, within our files, we've got sensitivity labels on our files too. We're then beginning to start, people only have access to what they need to have and what they have permission to. We then have things that have been around for quite a while in terms of data loss prevention, retention, and communications compliance. Data loss prevention is preventing sharing sensitive information. So say, for example, you are in a team and somebody asks for the credit card information. If you try to put that credit card information, it will automatically be blocked. Coming up into the security center here, you can see that, and there was the sensitivity labels that I was previously discussing. So if I go into data loss prevention, you can see when it now loads. So just wait for this to load up because I've pre-populated this before today. I have created a data loss prevention policy for UK financial data, and just simply selecting it, you can see that it is looking not just in Teams, in chat and in channel messages, but it's also looking for that in files that are stored in OneDrive or SharePoint, and if it comes up in mail for exchange. So if credit card information, somebody tries to share that within a team, or they try to share that in a document that's uploaded to Microsoft 365, that's automatically going to be blocked. And when creating that policy, Microsoft 365 has hundreds of out-of-the-box templates. So whether that's financial, for medical information, or for privacy, you can even customize your own. So for example, you can create one that if you didn't want people using profanity within Microsoft Teams, you could create your own keyword list and create your own custom DLP policy. So if people try to, or did start using profanity in conversations where you might have guests and partners in that team, it can automatically be blocked. So we have data loss prevention, we have retention policies. If we need to ensure that we've got some very sensitive information and you don't want it deleted, we can apply our retention policies. So you can retain policy for 7 years, or you can have it down in Teams for as low as a day. And again, like the data loss prevention policies, if you come into the Security and Compliance Center and we come down to information governance and retention, when we apply those retention policies, so if I go retention policy and click next, I can apply it for 7 years. If I simply click next, we can apply those policies right across Teams, and Office 365 groups, SharePoint sites and Exchange, and OneDrive for Business. We may need not just to use retention policies for compliance as they are typically used, we may also need to keep them for security. Then we also have communications compliance. So this is built upon supervision. It's going to replace supervision. And again, you can apply that to Teams, SharePoint Online, and OneDrive for Business. So I'm just going to jump in here to the communications compliance. You can create compliance policies based upon sensitive information. So sensitive information, meaning that if somebody discloses a secret or something, there could be a secret project that the company is working from, and you might need the people that have been in the meeting and are working on that secret project to not talk about it in terms of security. And if they start talking about it, and then there could be a serious data leak, or there could be an insider attack. There could be a problem. So you can use communication compliance for things like keywords. If any keywords come up in any Teams conversations, in any private chats, they will be flagged to the administrator immediately. So all of these things, data loss prevention, retention, and communication and compliance, ensure that that sensitive data is not leaked, that it's not left lying around, that it's not left open to insider risk. These are all tools in our tool bag for being able to increase our security posture within Microsoft Teams. You then, as we talked about within Intune, app protection policies. This protects the Teams mobile app on the devices. You're securing that Teams app whilst you're on the go. Now, I don't know how much experience everyone has within Intune, but app protection policies I find are one of the best features, because you can apply these protection policies to the app on the device. It prevents things. If we take the example of iOS, it prevents backups to iCloud. It prevents Teams from transferring any data to any app, or from receiving data from any app. In other words, if you have a rogue app that is downloaded from the store on the device, then Teams is protected against that. But also as well is it prevents users from copying and cutting data out of that app, or from saving that data to the device. We trust users, but can you trust them to not start copying your corporate data out and then sending it, using it for their own personal use, or sending it to others, corporations? Finally, in information, we have cloud app security. Cloud app security is an additional add-on. I think it's included in the EMS E5. This is Microsoft's Cloud App Security Broker. Now, I mentioned Cloud App Security because this is all about discovering apps within inside your environment. So if I come in and I look in Cloud App Security, I've connected Office 365, which includes Teams, and then I can apply all my policies to that. So some of the policies and looks like it just done a refresh there, is it can not only discover other clouds. So if other people are using things like Dropbox or Box to communicate with other people, if you have an insider attack, they could be siphoning off your data and then putting it out of another cloud application. Well, you can discover that with Cloud App Security. You can look at suspicious activities in Teams and in the rest of Office 365, such as mass downloading or access level changes. You can see if files have been shared with competitors' domains or files that are shared with unauthorized domains. Cloud App Security can monitor and alert your security admins to all of this, and it can also feed data into Azure Sentinel if you are using Sentinel as a CM. So now, as we move towards the end of the session, we move on to the fourth pillar, which is monitoring. 2 recommendations. First of all, use Secure Score. Secure Score will look at identity, okay, as well as several other things, and give you an all-up score for your environment. It will give you a number of improvement actions. But also, one of the best things is that it can also increase your understanding of the protection of the whole Microsoft 365 environment, including Microsoft Teams. And you have actions to do on a recurring basis. It's not just turn on and leave. You do things like you run reports that you can actually look and get the benefit of and analyze and see if there is any irregular or anomalous behavior that you can spot. It will really increase your risk awareness. And later on this year, there was announced at Ignite last year, we're going to be seeing Teams actions come into Secure Score 2 explicitly. The other kind of monitoring is in terms of productivity score. Now, this is in preview at this moment in time and has been demoed at a lot of the events over the last 6 months. Productivity score is how people use Microsoft 365, and a lot of this at this moment in time is based upon collaboration. You can look at users' behaviors and see if they're doing the right thing. So, for example, if they're sharing documents, are they sharing documents by attaching them to emails, which is probably the wrong way to go, or are they using proper sharing permissions in OneDrive and in SharePoint, which are, of course, underlying Microsoft Teams? Again, from using security score and productivity score together, you can begin to really ramp up your security posture, which will be a big help to Teams and give you a number of improvement. So regularly review your all-up security posture. In addition, monitor the audit logs. So if I come into the audited logs, so I'm going to come back into the Security Center, and if I come out of yes, I'm going to come down to search, and I'm going to come down to the audit log. This is the audit log search. Again, this is feels like this is going to refresh on me. So it's just loading up the Security Center again. Just waiting for this. There we go, the audit log search, show the results. And if then I come down and I type in Teams, you have got Microsoft Teams activities. In fact, there is a lot more than that. But here, this is where in the audit log, you can have an overview of all. If I just kind of scroll down here, so Microsoft Teams activities, you can see when teams were created, when channels were added, when members were removed, or when the team settings were changed. And then you can set alerts on all of these activities. So for example, if somebody has added another team and you have a policy of it's only created by certain people, then you can be notified straight away. If, for example, somebody tried to install an app again, and that app that you didn't know that app existed and it wasn't on your sanctioned list, then you can go and investigate that. So the audit log is really powerful for auditing Teams actions. You can export the log every 90 days. So and because it only lasts for 90 days, so it's an easy way to then house the log files in Azure or use the API to be able to access them and create their alerts. If the next point on Sentinel will also pull from the audit logs too, or you can use content search in order, which is a powerful searching tool that will work right across Exchange, SharePoint, and OneDrive. So now we're just finishing off. The last monitoring is to do with Sentinel in Azure. Sentinel collects the activity logs so that you can go hunting for that malicious behaviors, and just some of them, you can see some of these queries. This was in a blog recently put on the Microsoft Tech community. You can look at and fish out information from the audit log, such as external users were added and removed, new bots or apps were created, or you have external apps from analogous organizations. You use the security information to give you a bird's eye view down into your team's activities. This is really, I'd love to do a session on Sentinel. I'll hopefully be doing one in the autumn when I build it in my own tenant. Lastly is that education piece. Train your users. They are the last line of defense. It's not just about protecting the apps, protecting the data, or protecting the devices, but try to train on both teams and on security. You can get that through docs.com, learning pathways, MS Learn. You've got the CDX platform with demos.microsoft.com, the community blogs, courses, or certs. And also as well, something I'd recommend is to attack your users where you can. They call like the people that work in the bit, you know, your users in the organization, the human firewall, as it were, because they're the last line of defense but against many attacks. You can use things like the attack simulator in Office 365 ATP Plan 2 to launch things like spear phishing attacks, brute force attacks, password sprays. Create your own tenants, join as a guest and try to get information off of them. Send malicious links to them through Microsoft Teams and see if they click the button, because by attacking your users, you will harden them and increase their security education, because it's important to empower your users as much as it is to put these controls in place. So the calls to action, there are a load. What you can do today is use any number of things that you've seen in this today. This was an overload session. Hopefully, I'm going to pass on the deck to the organizers, and you'll get a copy of this deck, and hopefully you can play this back and review it again. Think of all of these pillars, think of your 101s, think of your identity, threat protection, information protection, and monitoring, and also think about education. So returning to the outcomes, we've looked at the why security is important. We've looked at the many ways today of how you can secure your team's instance, and we've had a ton of calls to actions to get hands-on and use them today. So I'd like to thank you ever so much. You can keep in contact with me through email, my email address, chris.horde@fusion.cloud. You can contact me through Twitter, LinkedIn. You can look at my blog, where I blog on many of these things at microsoft365pro.uk. I want to thank you ever so much for joining me today. And if you've got any questions, here is the raffle. So bit.ly M365 raffle, and remember to consider donating to the following charity relief funds: United Way and International Medical Corps. But I think we've got just a couple of minutes, because this was an action-packed session in terms of there was so much to cover. Do you have any questions out of the back of that?
There is. Hi, Chris.
Hi there.
Brilliant session. Thank you very much. There are a couple of questions in chat, but I think we've only got time for one. So the one I've chosen is Intune a separate license?
Intune is a separate license if you are adding it to an Office 365. So if you have Office 365 Business Essentials or Business Premium, you will need to add a separate Intune license. But what I'd recommend is to consider moving up to a Microsoft 365 plan. So Microsoft 365 Business Premium, that includes Intune. Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, that contains the whole EMS suite. So by moving to a Microsoft 365 SKU, you get Intune. But if you've only got an Office 365 one today, then you will need to add Intune separately. But I can't evangelize how worthwhile Intune is to apply those app protection policies and apply those device compliance and configuration policies. It is the security 101, and once you start using it, there's no way back. You'll be brought right in.
Thank you for that. There are some more questions in the Q&A section, so hopefully you can spend a few minutes afterwards doing that, but we need to get cracking with Vivek in a minute, so we'll have to terminate this session here, but thank you again.
No worries at all. Thank you ever so much. Thank you for having me and taking the time to watch it. See you later.